Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world right now. Thank you so much for joining Chess to Cults. Say that 3 times fast. Chess to Cults, How Life Experience Shapes Narrative Voice. We'll be discussing how we use our backgrounds and personal experiences to inspire our narrative design and how you can do the same. Before we give you our definition of narrative design, we're going to introduce ourselves.
Hi, I'm Kat Manning, she, her, and I'm a writer at Riot Games. Previously to that, I've done narrative design and writing for indie games, including on Pathologic 2 and Where the Water Tastes Like Wine. In general, I'm interested in procedural narrative and emergent storytelling. I came from academia and with a background in classics, and I still, even to this day, get a little bit too interested in Greek tragedy and drama.
Oh, is it my turn?
Yes.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Xalavier Nelson Jr., he, him. You might know me from my work on Skatebird, We Are the Caretakers, An Airport for Aliens, currently run by Dogs, Hypnospace Outlaw, or some of the dozens of other games I've worked on over the years. I'm a narrative director and writer, and I've definitely found that a range of unique life experiences has contributed to being able to have the ability to touch as many genres and titles as I have.
Hi, my name is Nessa Cannon, she, her. I'm an indie developer. I have a focus in branching narrative as well as horror. And I have a background in chess, which I believe influences my passion for branching narratives and nonlinear narratives.
Hi, I'm Sisi, they, them. I was recently nominated for the IGF Excellence in Narrative Award for Lion Killer. I'm currently working on the theory, and I have shipped Signs of the Sojourner for PC. Worked on a bunch of other projects that I'm not sure if I can really say yet. I have a BA in history, and a lot of my projects tend to revolve around history, mythology. I've also done a lot of branching narrative work, but mostly I just really like digging into old stories and see what I can harvest from the bones. So that's what I do.
And I am Toiya Kristen Finley, she, her. I am a writer and editor in general. In games specifically, I am a game designer, narrative designer, game writer, editor, and diversity consultant. I co-wrote a book called The Game Narrative Toolbox, and I edited and contributed to a book called Narrative Tactics for Mobile and Social Games Pocket-Sized Storytelling. I am on the executive board of the IGDA Game Writing Special Interest Group. I have worked on everything from AAA to indie, and I use a lot of my personal experience from everything from major plot lines to mundane details in my narrative design. And what do we mean by narrative design? It can mean a lot of different things depending on the studio or the narrative designer. When we're talking about narrative design, we're not talking about game writing. Game writing is a story. Narrative design is more the story delivery or the myriad number of ways players can interact with the story across all the game's features. Narrative design includes world building, branching, and dialogue systems, but it's also in the UI, the mechanics, the music, the art, any part of the game. So the UI in Mass Effect looks like it could be the UI of an actual spaceship. Why? Because the player character leads a spaceship crew. The first Life is Strange is heavily influenced by its narrative design as it reflects the player character's inner world. The font in the game's UI and menus is the player character's handwriting. The art in the UI and menus is in her sketching style because she's an artist. Even the soundtrack is the music that she listens to. Narrative design is story delivery and the ways that the player experiences the story, world, and characters in any facet of the game. So with that, let's look at how we use our backgrounds to inform our work as narrative designers. So using past experiences to inform storytelling is something that filmmakers, novelists, comic writers, novelists, academics, and animators do all of the time. Why is using our past or personal experiences so valuable to us as storytellers?
if I think this kind of goes back to something that Sisi started with, right? Which is that you can look at history, you can look and harvest the bones, because God knows colonializers have been doing it long enough. Harvest those bones yourself and use them to create new stories, new foundations, new worlds on top of the foundations that are almost inside of us now, these familiar ones. When you do that, when you take that approach to your own life, not ignoring your own humanity or capacity to operate, but instead saying, here's the number of ways in which my life experiences can give me a unique way, or even just a cool way to look at the world, to approach my work and my life, and improving my relationships with others. It's a perspective that not only improves your narrative design, but your life in general.
Yeah, to add to what Xalavier and Sisi were saying, I think there's something really valuable in a multiplicity of perspectives on the same subject, right? That we all sort of bring to the table our own different life experiences, and being able to put that down into a story and offer it to other people who haven't necessarily had the same lived experience is so valuable for bridging gaps, for figuring out what we have in common, but also hearing what we're missing because we haven't had that experience ourselves.
So, Kat, would you say that pulling from life experiences, pulling from your background is innovative in a way?
I would, yeah, absolutely. I think it lets us tell both new stories and what we might think of as old stories in a new way. Going back to mythology and looking at it through lenses that we have now, especially given what we as individuals or as people from our own, individual cultures have come through, gives us a way to reshape and interact with our history and our past in ways that are really fundamentally reparative, at least from my perspective.
Yeah, I wanted to touch on that. When you said the word innovative, I really liked it, and I've been interested in narrative design for not that long of a time, but I've always found myself really drawn to branching narratives and to how to make unique branches and stuff like that. And what does meaningful mean in terms of choices? And I had this really wild moment with I was talking to my chess coach, the man who taught me how to play chess when I was about 4 or 5, and he was asking me about narrative design and what makes it different from novel writing. And I was like, you can write these choices and you can have all these storylines and there's just like endless possibilities. And he was like, wow, that's wild. It's almost like you grew up playing a game with more possible outcomes than there are atoms in the universe. Like, it's wild that like you've taken chess and what you've learned in that and have put it towards something else. And that was like such a huge moment for me. It was, really validating, like, wow, I am, let's kick this imposter syndrome out. I'm doing things. And I have these past skills that, have really helped me figure out what I want to do with my games and how I can make branches interesting.
Okay, now I feel nervous about going last because my reason for incorporating personal experience is not really that deep. My reason is because making games is really hard. Like, it's so hard. And unless it's a client project, like, I take a different approach with clients. But personally, if I'm making a personal game, I'd better be willing to grind at that computer for, like, hours every single day, every single week, and like for months on end. So personally, I'm like, if I have to put that kind of investment into a video game, then it better be like something that just will not leave me alone. Some story that really buried itself inside of my rib cage and just would not get out until like I forced it into a game. So I'm just like, if something gives me a brain worm, then I'll make a game out of it. That's because I think people really like don't talk enough about how hard it is to motivate yourself sometimes when when making games is such delayed gratification. It's like the ultimate delayed gratification. So that's kind of where I come from with this.
I think making things easier is totally valid. Making games is very, very difficult. So anything that makes the process easier, I would say is really important. Kat, did you want to jump?
I was just going to say, even when you're writing like dialogue, actors already talk about, they pull upon experiences to make themselves cry.
Mm-hmm.
It makes perfect sense that a writer or narrative designer would do that for looking at how a UI moment could perhaps touch on imagery in their past or that they know is shared among their culture to create an emotional moment.
Something oh, sorry, go ahead, Kat.
I was just going to say, I've definitely in my own work thought about like, oh, what did this feel like to be in this situation? And how can I reflect that in UI? Like, how can I really make the player experience that, in the same way that I did, like casting back to like an actual physiological sensation. And, I think without that, I shouldn't say without that, but with that, it's a lot stronger.
Something I've always found really important, whether it's something that I lived through, whether I'm pulling something from something I studied, I think using what I know is really important because it makes what I'm writing or designing more believable. It's authentic because it happened to me. Even if I'm working in a genre setting like fantasy or science fiction, there are those little mundane or real world details that make everything so much more believable. You don't have to prove that something you went through is authentic. You're telling the story of yourself, and therefore it is believable.
Go.
So we talked about like multiplicity of perspectives, innovation. What are other ways that pulling from our lived-in experiences, our past histories, important to narrative design? How do they make our narrative design better?
Okay, so I am really, really have a strong focus on lore because I was a history major. And it's actually really different from being, say, like an English major or a drama major because I think compared to like some other like fields, I've had to handle a huge volume of information. Like when you have to learn about like 20 different historical actors in one course across like several decades and like all the things that happen, you really have to cherry pick what's important and like try to keep people's attention. Because like if you think about the example of the ghost instructor from Harry Potter about how history is the most boring course, it's like, yeah, that's the challenge we have to face in communicating our ideas of like, here's all the stuff that happened, please don't fall asleep. And I think that kind of perspective really helps me create games because lore heavy games are really dangerous in that they can make you feel like you're studying for a history exam. And I think it's really important for lore heavy games to not do that. So I personally, I'm always taking an approach of like trying to relate information to the player, trying to figure out what their knowledge level is instead of just assuming that they're completely up to speed. So just having that background of having like a very dense academic field and knowing what information to like pick out of like 500 pages, just knowing which information needs to be spoon-fed to the player, it's really valuable experience. And I find that not everyone necessarily has this kind of academic training.
And I would say that this can also apply to a developer working in a different genre entirely. So talking about past experiences or backgrounds, if you're not someone who likes making a tactics game, a JRPG, a open world title, a first person shooter, looking through the prism of your own experience and background, saying what doesn't appeal to me here, what could appeal to me in this setting that I'm not typically interested in, even in terms of the game mechanics that are used and produced, can have such a powerful effect on not just pulling in others like you, but giving people who do love that genre a unique perspective on something that they already really enjoy.
And there's something I think really important about that ability to do research as well. At least from my personal perspective, it's given me kind of like a unique background on it because in the way that classics works, everything is fragmentary. You only get bits and pieces, and you kind of have to assemble a picture from a bunch of disparate sources. There's no one real main version. Once you sort of start digging down, there's a bunch of little small versions. And I think that really influences how I sort of do narrative design and how I like to present story to players. Because it's much more fragmented. There's never sort of like one, here is the real canonical story. Here is a bunch of things that you can amass to make a pretty good picture of a canonical story. And it's sort of up to you about how far you want to go with it. And I think there's something really useful about, at least for me, about getting the player involved with that kind of active, reparative, going back to the past and actually seeing what's there and seeing what isn't and figuring out what you can assemble and what you can extrapolate that's really meaningful.
Do you find that especially useful working on large IP where what space you do have to define one answer is limited?
Yes, very much so. And it's very good in the sense of going back to things that sort of have been defined before as hard canon or as soft canon and sort of looking at them and saying, okay, like what has been established? What is, what do the players know? How have they responded to that? Is there something here that I can take and make pay off in a way that feels really good for everybody involved? And that's really satisfying. But then there's also the feeling of like, okay, what haven't we defined yet? Where are the open spaces to play? That's also very useful on the flip side of that coin as well.
Okay. Yeah, I was really sympathetic to what Kat said about assembling random pieces together, because that's very much history. Like, you have to take someone's lunch receipt and figure out what information you can pull from it. And like, just like knowing how different pieces come together is kind of like a huge kind of like an advantage in designing for narrative.
Research. I'm a person who can get stuck in a library for hours, look for old books, stay at a computer looking for just the right source. And research is extremely important to any kind of design, any kind of writing, because just in the act of researching, you get so many ideas. It's like you get so many jumping off points. But research can be extremely intimidating for people. So, for those of us who have been in the academy and who have escaped the academy, what are some quick tips about how to do really good research? And then knowing, well, maybe this is really cool, but I don't need to go down the rabbit hole looking at this. I can come back to this later in my own time because I find it cool.
My best tip on this is the book review. Find a book you like and think is interesting, and instead of reading the entire book, see if you have access to JSTOR. There's a whole rant about institutional technology and the way we are barred from it that I have that I'm not going to get into. But if you have access to... Sorry?
Oh, that's next year's PAX talk.
Yes, exactly. If depending on whether or not I get my JSTOR access back. But basically, if you can find sort of somebody else, another academic writing on the academic text you are looking at, that will save you a lot of time. And it will also give you a perspective of where this text fits into the field. Is it a good summary? Is it particularly innovative? And is it what you're looking for? And then honing in on the sections that you think are going to be most useful to you, and then flipping to the back, going to the bibliography, seeing what's most useful, repeat the process. I would not recommend anybody do a thesis this way. I would recommend people do research on a deadline this way.
Any other tips?
Oh, yeah.
If you don't...
Actually, this is specifically about writing for fiction games. Sorry. Lag.
Go ahead.
Okay, so this is specifically for writing fiction games because I'm actually writing, like, right now I'm working on a Minotaur game that's, like, queer and, like, obviously very ahistorical in that the plot is very ahistorical and, like, just straight up, like, made up. But when you're making fictional games that are just happen to have a historical setting, you don't have to be accurate. And I think that when you hold yourself hostage to, like, accuracy, that's when you just... And because, like, the point of creating fiction is not necessarily to like educate the facts, it's about educating themes. So I think as long as you can pull out the themes, like immediately, I think when you would like after a while, if you've like been sifting through enough information, if something just looks interesting, then you could just grab it and use it. You just immediately just immediately ask yourself like, would the audience find this interesting? Or is there an interesting way for me to put this in the world building that would be interesting on a meta level? And it's immediately, I think it's very easy to make snap judgments of this is good, this is kind of like not as useful, or like people might not just like care about this, and just like start compiling collection. Because what I do when I look up like Wikipedia articles is literally just like bullet point stuff that I think might be useful later, and just like throw out the rest and don't think about the rest. Or I do think about the rest, but it's just like in terms of like just collecting quick like pieces of information to use can be very good for production schedule reasons.
So the title of this talk starts with chess to cults. So we've heard a little bit about the chess. I'm guessing we're going to get to some cults in this next question. But what are the ways that you have applied your background knowledge or your lived experiences in your work? Like, are there some specific examples that you can give that aren't under NDA?
I mean, my first thought on this is really broad, which is the fact that I'm a narrative designer at all is because I was a classicist. When I started off learning about classics, I kind of thought that, the people who translate these plays that I love, there's like 5 of them and they all sit in the ivory tower and I can't become one of them. And I, took an intro mythology class, and that's when I found out that like, no, I can do Greek. And it was incredibly difficult, but, I started from this place of I have no idea what the subject is. And ended in a place where I knew what I was doing. And so when I realized that like narrative designer was a thing that I could be, I was like, oh, I have a model for how to get from I know nothing about the practicalities of what this means, but I love it, to I am actually very good at this. So that I knew that I could do it because I'd already done it, if that makes sense.
You overcame imposter syndrome by saying, hey, I've actually already done this before.
Exactly. And it felt just as scary back then. And like, I had no idea that I was going to make it through that, but I did. And I have, the external feedback to prove it. So what's stopping me from just doing that again? It doesn't feel that different.
Yeah, I think my very first Twine game was really chess inspired, and I didn't really know it. It's got this really early split. Twine is really choice-based and non-linear, and I didn't have an idea for this game I had to make for a class, and I just had this, I was playing chess, and I had this big idea that was like, well, what if the first decision that you make changes the whole course of the game? And I was really excited about that idea, and so I made this whole game where one side, you make this decision at the very beginning, and one side of the decision you play as a human, and the other side of the decision you play as a monster. And that felt really, it's like opening a chess game. You can move the E pawn up, or you can move, the A pawn up and be really wild. And so that felt, looking back on it, felt really chess based.
I'm the person who was the cult part of the chess to cults equation. We moved to a town that was controlled by a cult because the realtor decided that was something that you should absolutely leave off the listing. I ended up not joining the cult, but unintentionally working for them as like a lawn landscaper and like finding remnants of I wouldn't say crimes, but like children's ribbons torn on compounds where the people didn't have children, and bunker entrances and other such things. I was abducted at one point and taken to a windowless room where they fed me lukewarm pizza and told me about the apocalypse. The direct comparisons to this experience for game development are not quite there, and I haven't made a game about this yet. But one important piece that it did give me, I think, is, and I only realized this recently, it sort of created a backdoor in my storytelling that I wasn't aware of. So a lot of my storytelling and scenarios are based around someone who is in an absurd situation, who is given or an absurd task, and just kind of goes with it, and then finds what life is like on the other end of having to go through this thing. And sometimes I'd run into places where audiences didn't find that believable, like, hey, I would have just broken out of the windowless room filled with cultists, etc. That equivalent. And I've only recently, through a lot of introspection and pseudotherapy, come to the realization, it's like, oh shoot, the reason that so much of my storytelling is based around the consequences, around intentionally saying what's important isn't how you got here. What's important is that you're here now, and what are the consequences resulting of that, and the interesting layers that emerge from being put into that situation and having to live with it. A lot of that comes from having to go through those processes myself. So even in terms of the flip side of this, not just how I've intentionally incorporated narrative design, my experiences into my narrative design, but how those experiences have incorporated themselves into the way I see storytelling. It's a really interesting thing to consider.
Congratulations, you have won PAX. I am really, really sorry that you went through that, but I am glad that you were able to make art out of it. I think I jumped over Kat, sorry.
Oh, I have the feeling that we were about to say the same thing, which was, my question was, do you find that sort of that the way you use that in your storytelling, in your game design, does that feel like more reparative in a way, for these really, I think absurd is the light way of putting it. These really harrowing, difficult, kind of through the looking glass moments that in being able to use them in your work, that there's a kind of ability to kind of come to terms with them and process them in a way that feels healthier than kind of just like letting them fester.
I think you've noted one of the most important pieces of narrative design right there, which is context is everything. So there's one angle from this, which is that because I was a teenager who had seen Leave It to Beaver and was like, I'm going to loathe the lawns of the elderly people near me. That's how American kids make money. That led me to working for a cult. That's one angle of which to see it, sort of this psychological horror thriller thing that I didn't realize the full consequences of at the time, but have gained a growing awareness of since then. And the other side of that is how is treating it as absurdism, treating it as a place from which to consider ideas, consider world building, for example, or other circumstances in my life that have also revolved around sort of going along with a weird situation, getting out of it, and on the other side, discovering what that means for the future. As narrative designers, our entire job sometimes, especially when we're brought late into a project, is look at what exists and decide how we feel about it, decide how to convey that to a player, decide how to bring the most effective version of that to light. And I really like the term reparative, because even that simple context shift of this was absurd versus, oh my gosh, I can't believe that happened, that can make all of the difference.
What I found really fascinating about all of your answers is that your past experiences in one way or another opened up like this revelatory door to what narrative design is and what it can be. And I guess that's why I'm really shocked that we don't hear the industry talk more about using personal experience, about using our backgrounds, about using our life experiences. We know it happens. There are games that we can point to. There are anecdotes we have heard from friends where they talk about, how this character was inspired by somebody they knew, or, there are details, there are storylines. We know that happens. The thing that I have always wondered is, why, as an industry, do we not talk about using this as a technique more? And how do we encourage, other developers to use our past experiences in designs?
I think it's fair to say on the indie end, because I occupy the indie end, rather, that because there is a lot of incentive to, for lack of a better term, style match. There is I believe when we talk about narrative, because can sometimes be a part of productions that have hundreds, if not thousands, of people involved at one point or another along their along their life cycle, it can feel inappropriate or greedy to discuss, I'm going to inject my personality into this. But as you very rightly pointed out, everybody's already doing this. Artists are drawing from their own inspirations and storytelling resources and pieces of powerful imagery and experiences in their life. Programmers are going off of things that they've built before, using lessons that they have learned along the way. Storytelling is all about reaching someone on a personal level and getting them to care about side mission number 3A. So it makes all of the sense in the world to change that conversation and discuss how your personal experience doesn't mean wrenching the rest of the production away from the hundreds of other people who share in it, but rather contributing to a tapestry with something that allows you to make something that would be more effective for your players than if it operated any other way.
Yeah, that really resonates with me, especially the idea of making this tapestry, and this idea that like everybody puts their unique stamp on it on the project as it goes through. I've seen people self-censor. It's really interesting to see, sort of coming from a AAA background. I think there's this idea that I've seen some of my colleagues have of, well, this won't necessarily be relevant, or somebody else on the team won't get what I'm saying. They won't, get this reference, so I just won't include it. And, for the most part, I work on a team that's really, really encouraging of like, no, bring that to the table, throw it out there, let's talk it through. And that's been really great to see, because you get all of these sort of, you get people selling you on what they are seeing in this and why that's important. And so you end up sort of learning about that, first of all. And I think there's this really major ability that I really believe in, which is that there's no such thing as this won't communicate to X audience. There is a thing of maybe this formulation isn't the right way to communicate this to X audience. But then the challenge becomes finding the formulation, not throwing the experience away and sanding down the edges of it, to turn it into something that feels like deeply relatable to everybody, and then thus really relatable deeply to nobody. And I'm not saying that every game, either indie or AAA, does this successfully. But that I think that the more we learn to trust our instincts as designers and advocate for our own visions and for our fellow colleagues' visions, staying in there, we get more interesting stories that way, and we learn to tell them better to people who don't necessarily share our background.
So I personally can't relate to the question, just because I am like kind of unashamedly, like ridiculously personal about my projects. And it's actually worked out mostly to my advantage, just because people are like, ooh, I've never seen that before. I'm like, cool, like that's cool. Game with Twine at a college with and being judged by one of the creators of Twine, so that was pretty cool. And I actually lost that game because I didn't save it properly. But it was a game about working at Chipotle for my summer college job. And the sheer anguish being a Chipotle worker at one of the busiest Chipotles in all of in Austin area, Texas. I was just the sheer despair, and really there were some amazing Twines out there, but the judges, it really reached out to the judges, the sheer amount of despair I had working at a Chipotle that just grinded you into dust. So I think I think when you pull from yourself, it's you can really pull people your audience in. So I've had nothing but better, I've only had better outcomes when pulling from personal experience. But when I talk to other people, I'm like, hey, you have this really cool idea for personal Twine. Why don't you make it? And these are people who have worked professionally in the industry. They're like, no, I don't think I should do that. I'm just like, why? And I think there's this barrier. I think after a while, I think it's a psychological barrier that it's less of a game, less of a video game with a capital V if you make it too personal. Like it's somehow like you somehow degraded the work into like something that is not video games. And I think that's just like and personally I just like I can't really understand the mentality. Because I think that just means we need to expand the definition of what a video game is. Because if there's no space for human beings in a video game, it's like kind of like then why are we working in narrative design? Why are we trying to put stories into a video game? So
Well, and narrative designers, like when we're working in a team, we're not just doing the narrative design, but we are facilitators. We are encouragers, because oftentimes we're working with people who are like, well, I'm bad at telling stories. And you have to say, well, no, you're pretty brilliant at telling stories. Your art tells a story. Your sound design helps to tell a story. The animation, helps to define the characterization of this NPC. And are there any like techniques you've talked about, discussing with other devs, who aren't writers or narrative designers, but are there any specific techniques that you have used to really encourage them, like maybe when, one-on-one or we're reviewing work, or, what are some of the things that you've found that's really helpful to encouraging your teammates?
I haven't worked on a ton of team settings, but I know what works for me in terms of writing more personal things, because I get really nervous about writing really personal things, to the point where I kind of bury them under the premise of the game. And the thing that I have to tell myself is that, I wanted to write novels. That was what I thought I was going to school for and everything. And when I found narrative design, it was just, it was so different because it felt more empathetic, and that I can put somebody directly in my shoes of this thing that I experienced and try to view it through that lens of like, well, I can share this with people, even if it wasn't necessarily a positive experience, I can communicate it in this way. That's the little pep talk I have to give myself before I, like, hey, I'm going to write a game about this, deeply personal relationship I have. All my narrative designer friends are like, go for it. That sounds wild. It sounds really relatable to a lot of people. And so I just think that everybody has stories that are, that really evoke a lot of empathy without really knowing it.
I like that. It's being kind to yourself and encouraging yourself in a way, and making sure that those stories get out there through talking to other people as well. You know what works for you.
I think especially someone who's in a lot of lead and direction positions these days, the way I approach it is kind of a 3-step process. The first begins with, as Kat and Nessa pointed out, being vulnerable yourself, starting with vulnerability, saying, here's what we're trying to accomplish. Here's why we're trying to accomplish it. Here are the personal elements that go into this. Here are the overall project and systemic goals that go into this. Here are our constraints, being as upfront and clear about those as possible, not just in terms of your own development approach, but also in terms of what you're trying to achieve. And then opening that floor and saying, if these are our bounds, I want to see your work within those bounds. And then in the third step, actually paying off on that, not asking for people's faith or for their ideas or for their concepts, and then being like, but being very clear about what you're rigid on and what is flexible, and then continuing to really, I keep thinking of the word pay off, almost like narratively, being like, yes, actually, that's fantastic. Yes, I'd like to see more of this. Yes, that doesn't quite fit, but here's how we can bend this and make something all better together. Quite simply starting from that place yourself and communicating that to a team, and then actually allowing that thing to breed creates this exponential process, in my experience, where suddenly you can't really stop people anymore. You don't want to stop them in the first place, but you have a team that kind of to a certain degree is sustainable internally. It runs itself. It is self-caring. It is self-observing. It is self-aware. And that's a really special thing to be a part of.
I think finding... Oh, sorry. I was just going to say that I think finding commonality of experiences is really important, which touches a little bit on empathy. For example, if you have a dog companion, and hopefully you're not killing the dog companion, stop video games, murdering dogs, you might work with the team saying, well, did anybody have a pet dog, or does anybody have a pet dog? And so then you start talking about your dogs, like what are they like? Can your dogs, or, a dog that you had when you were younger, inspire the dog that goes into the game? And that's not just important for the creative process, but it's also important in relationship building, because you are in a collaborative relationship and you do want to become comfortable with each other, and you do want to learn how everybody communicates, because everybody has a different communication style. But what I also think is really important is that the more people feel comfortable being able to share, the more marginalized voices are going to speak, because a lot of times marginalized people are not going to share because they're used to getting shut down. So I think that if we encourage people to create a space where they can share about their personal experiences, or things that they have done in the past, and they notice, oh, hey, we have this in common, they're going to be more likely to speak up about things that maybe you're not necessarily looking at your background experiences or pulling from those. It might be something that's more technical. Just freeing people up to speak and to bring their expertise to the table when they may not feel like they can because of what they've lived through in the past.
It's a really good formulation of it. I don't have anything to add. That resonates with me.
So I did want to ask, are there any particular games that you know for a fact that the narrative design is inspired by, a lived experience, or, the narrative designer's background? And you would say that's a really great example of what we're talking about. And it would be good to kind of analyze the narrative design in that game, besides your own, of course. Yeah, go ahead.
I would love to start if people are cool with that, because I'm really actually passionate about this and how it relates to several other games I would want to touch on. But Disco Elysium is the big one for me. It is so clearly a game made out of Robert Kurvitz's, I believe that's how you pronounce his name, lived experience, and what he has been thinking about for nearly a decade, what he's written about in his novel, what he's lived through politically and socially speaking. And his perspective is so clear to me. And again, it's a game that lets you explore a bunch of different ways of thinking about Revachol's internal social and political landscape through the thought cabinet. It doesn't say this is the one way to think about it, but it provides you this vast expanse of a world in which a revolution was tried and failed, and everybody is living through it. And there are all of these ways to see all of the perspectives on the ground. And it just feels like such a personal game, but also such a game that it's so easy, at least for me and for many narrative designers that I know, to get into and to inhabit that space in without necessarily saying, oh, I can map this on one-to-one directly with my life. And it really, really resonates for me. There's a couple other games that have come out of Eastern European studios in the past couple of years that I think also really, really have very clear and different perspectives than Disco Elysium. But I think it's interesting to put them in conversation together. And for me, that's This War of Mine by 11-Bit. And obviously Pathologic 2 and stemming off of Pathologic, which I think I feel like that's fair game to include because the original came out like 10 years, 15 years before, I started working on it. So But yeah, I feel really strongly that all three of those games are very clearly informed by their designers and studios' lived experiences and perspectives in ways that I don't think other designers who had not had those very, very specific perspectives would necessarily have wanted to bring to the table. And I'm glad that all of them exist.
Well, I've got three also. The first is That Dragon Cancer, which is really memoir as video game. It uses the mechanics and the world itself as the emotional journey that these parents went.
I was just going to say.
Hey, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that, Kat, your comments there, especially about hearing and feeling someone's perspective and voice, really resonated with me. Because, to be honest, again, as Sisi rightly pointed out, it feels like the industry tends to phrase the personal having an identifiable stamp as a less legitimate thing. Like we're supposed to just be invisible behind the surface, but it feels so, and yet it feels so good to just have something that is recognizable as, oh, that feels like someone's actual perspective. That feels like someone's actually saying something, even if you don't know who the person is.
Mm-hmm.
The personal is universal.
Yeah.
It absolutely is. And, the one thing I was going to say about That Dragon Cancer is that emotional landscape and that emotional journey. It's so honest and raw. I think some of the most honest things I've ever heard a person say are in that video game. Like when the mother is like, I don't want this child. I don't want this child, because she didn't want people to believe that she was having another child to replace her son who was going to die of cancer. And, people don't usually admit thoughts like that. And it really uses the mechanics and the world itself as a metaphor of, what was happening through their lives, going through literal trials and tribulations of what their son was going through. And then Papa and Yo is another one that was based on the creative lead's experience with an alcoholic father. And so, like, the main NPC in the game is also the big bad of the video game, and he's always following you. And there are metaphors around alcoholism. He eats frogs. When he eats frogs, he becomes violent. And it's the how a child would understand their father's transformation. And again, it's using mechanics, but then that's narrative design, what we're talking about. The storytelling is also in the way you play. And I think that's another really powerful one. And then I think another way that we can think about using our lived-in experiences, like, it doesn't have to be like on this macro level where it influences everything. It could be something very, very small. And that's the quiche under the bench in Undertale, which I just think is really hilarious. Toby Fox, in real life, found a quiche under a bench in a park, and he made it a health item in the game, and it fit with the very whimsical, surreal world that he created. So there are these little things that you can pull, from your past. It doesn't have to be like something, profound. It can be little things, but again, that works. It's authentic, and you've never seen a quiche under a bench in a video game before. So as we're wrapping up, are there any words of wisdom that you would leave to narrative designers who are maybe thinking about, how can I work on my narrative design, fine tune it a little bit? Or as I said earlier, you all mentioned how, your backgrounds gave you a window into what narrative design could be. Any final thoughts that you would like to leave with the audience?
I think that when you have no budget and you don't really have many collaborators because you're not as famous yet, the only real weapon you have in your arsenal is sheer unfiltered sincerity. Like, I think there are too many projects out there that don't have sincerity, that are trying to be, it's not quite successfully being. And when you really you can't, when you just don't have the means to create an actual a facade of a game that is an impersonation of something, the only thing it can be is something that's something that is vivid and real to experience. So I just really think that sincerity can make up for for not having a budget. And I mean, I did this with Lion Killer. This was the second game I've ever made in my entire life in Twine. I didn't know what the heck I was doing. I was literally learning how to debug things in real time as I was making the game. But I mean, it vibed with people because people thought that I actually meant what I was saying about things, about the war, and people thought that it was interesting. And so even though I was I don't know what I was doing, and the bug was in my game for a game breaking bug was in here for 9 months. I mean, it still landed somehow. So
one reason I love that in Lion Killer is that it felt like reading a history book where the historian had a very particular perspective on this conflict and scenario, and this information was being delivered from that perspective. It mirrored the exact same research that you had done through. You basically made a history book, but as an indie game, which is wild.
And gorgeous and so good.
I almost went to grad school. I went to grad school.
As somebody who went to grad school,
Ivory Tower.
Good call.
I hated the Ivory Tower culture. Yeah, I hated the culture. I was I'm not going to grad school. I hate everyone in my cohort. So I was just I want to make something relevant, something that people will actually read. So apparently Lion Killer did that, which was better than a history thesis, honestly.
Yeah, you didn't have to do the history thesis to get your history book out, and it had gay smooches. Everyone wins.
Woo! Well, yeah, as a college,
it did.
As a college dropout, that's super relatable, and the way that I've been able to do anything in narrative design is just by taking all of the feelings I have in my tiny Irish body and just turning them into mechanics, and just being no, I'm gonna make a weird game without any dialogue tags. It's just gonna be words, and people are gonna get it, and it's gonna work. And just just personal experience and stubbornness. Two tips. Yeah, you gotta utilize
stubbornness. Stubbornness is a big part of it.
Yeah.
Honestly, for me, my narrative design gets better the weirder I get. The more I sort of let that come out. I still remember something from a talk that Meghna Jiang did at GDC one year, which is that nobody is the default. Everybody has something unique to them, a unique perspective. There's no such thing as the default. It's just the thing that we amass and shove people in because they're close enough to it. And if you find that thing that's yours and personal, that touched you and is just a little bit weird or a little bit different, or you saw in a different way, and you lean into that, that's real and that's genuine and sincere. And that's, in my opinion, where real art comes from. And the more you can do that, the stronger as an artist you'll be.
I think that's a really important point. What are things that you are passionate about, that you've been thinking about for a long time, that you don't hear anyone else talking about? Because that's where you can have a voice and contribute and also make things relatable from your point of view.
Yes.
And actually, with that, we are out of time. Thank you so much for joining us. Please stay safe and enjoy the rest of your PAX.
Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.